My name's Christina de Blake. I'm a historian based here in Oxford, and I'm really excited to be here today to see colleagues in person and online at what I think is one of the best events that happens every year in Oxford, this colloquium organised by Sean and the other organisers. It's always a fantastically enriching event. And I'm here to chair the first panel today, which is on children as heritage visitors. And our first speaker is Matthew Grenby, who's Professor of 18th Century Studies in the School of English and Dean of Research and Innovation for the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Newcastle. And he is going to be speaking on They Who Have Tickets Are Desired Not to Bring Children Towards a History of Young People at Heritage Sites. And I'll leave him to it and introduce the other speakers as we go.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really glad this event is happening on children and heritage. I suppose we just heard in that plenary from Caro about how absolutely fundamental, how central children and young people are to heritage sites, heritage provision now. And I suppose what I'm asking in this paper, in a very, very abbreviated way, is how we got there over a long period. This is coming from a book that I'm trying to write with Barbara Gribbling, who was speaking yesterday, about this long history of children's engagement with heritage. Very complicated text, a very complicated term, heritage, and there are all sorts of problems with it. But you know what I mean by heritage, so I'm not going to go into that too much. And I'm trying to find out, across all sorts of different media, how that relationship is built up over 300, 400 years. There's one chapter, the first chapter, which is about children actually at sites, and that's what I've tried to distill down really, really quickly to this paper, and to make it as kind of fast as possible, I've crushed everything into three quite crude phases, and they're quite kind of the first one is informal and unacknowledged, and we're really looking at kind of the 17th and 18th century here. I'm using a lot of the detail here. What in each of these phases I'll try and do is look at one particular kind of strand of evidence and just have a look about what that can tell us about this long history. If I go back, that's my title. That comes from what Horace Walpole put in the regulations for visitors to his Gothic Revival villa at Strawberry Hill. As you can see, don't bring children. And it was absolutely the same wherever you went in the 18th century in Britain. At the British Museum, for instance, founded in 1757, the original regulation said no children to be admitted to the museum. And it was the same at the first picture gallery as well, at Dulwich, where it said children under 14 are objected to. So this is quite clear. This is the kind of image that we're faced with. It can seem that children and young people are just not understood as a desirable presence at heritage sites. But what I'd argue is that doesn't tell the whole picture at all. Actually, when we look a little bit more deeply, from very early, children are going to be at these heritage sites in ways that, we can kind of recapture from all sorts of different archival evidence. I can't spend too long on this. We're talking about memoirs of people who would go on to become antiquarians, perhaps, like Stukely or Agnes Strickland. We're looking at memoirs, we're looking at letters, we're looking at diaries. There's all sorts of scattered evidence that we can kind of get together from different archival sources. A lot of it applies to elite children, absolutely, middle-class children as well. A lot of it we know is going to be absent from that record, but nevertheless, it makes quite a compelling case. I mean, just to take one example, I've looked at a diary recently from Carolyn Libb Powys, who visited the British Museum as a girl in 1760. She shouldn't have been allowed to, according to the regulations, but she was certainly there, went on to take her daughter, and we've got a whole history of that kind of visiting. But the one particular kind of evidence, and I was just putting up some slides to remind myself, there are visitors' books as well. I've been really interested in the visitor books at Knowle, for instance, Knowle Palace in Kent, which record lots of children visiting in the late 18th, early 19th century. So the scattered record is quite compelling on this. But the one kind of source of evidence I want to just mention briefly in this phase is what I call family tours. Now, these were, not really holidays in the family holidays in the modern sense, but for elite families, increasingly for middle-class families across the 18th and into the 19th century, these are kind of protracted tours around Britain, typically taken in small family groups, covering a lot of ground. Their itinerancy is their key factor, and the children are encouraged to keep journals, and it's those journals and letters as well, which we can find in lots and lots of archives, and I've been looking at those across Britain in lots of kind of local archives, and central to all of them are encounters with what we now call heritage sites of various different kinds. So they visit natural beauty sites, they visit factories as well, but absolutely central are monuments, prehistoric monuments, castles, churches, country houses, anything of that nature. Now, you know, they can be taken by young children, by older children, and often they're very conventional. I mean, this is a particularly beautiful example. This is illustrated by an adult, but I think it gives a nice kind of image of what these tours might have been like, even if this one is slightly comical, as you can see this kind of whole cavalcade of a family at the top there, and then once they actually get into the stately home that they've gone to see. But you know, these are fascinating documents. They are very, very conventional. You know, they're written to be read, and they're supposed, I suppose, to show that the proper response to these kind of sites that people are visiting. But also, they do show, you know, when you read these accounts, they can give a clear idea, I think, of the kind of responses that children had to these sites, often very emotional. Often they're really talking about the physicality of the experience. You know, they're standing in a particular spot that they've read about in their history books. They're seeing where, I don't know, a famous duel took place. They're stealing a bit of Shakespeare's chair very often. They're, you know, looking for where Rizzio's blood is on the floor at Holyrood House. They're holding a long dead corpse in their arms. That seems to have been a particular motif that they were, you know, a particular attraction at lots of different sites. And, you know, some of these are really, really beautiful. I'm not sure if Catherine Gleadle is here, but these are... Thank you very much for pointing me to the direction of this one I found in Hull Archive, which is just a fantastically detailed account of a small strip and wonderfully illustrated, just to show the level of engagement that we see in these tours, these family tours. So we know that these were happening in large numbers for elite and middle-class children all the way through to the early 19th century. And in fact, what I find really interesting is that they become part of the published record as well. The family tour book becomes, you know, an established genre of children's literature by the end of the 18th and into the early 19th century. This is just 3 examples from one year, 1804. You can see there Priscilla Wakefield's family tour through the British Empire, John Evans, the juvenile tourist, and an anonymous one, the tour through England, described in a series of letters. These are all modelled on the kind of journals and letters that people are supposed to do on the tour. And my point there, I suppose, would be, is that these books, these printed records, show how a tour could be undertaken, but also surely created an appetite for them. And so I think the point of this first session, this first phase rather, is that, you know, even despite these prohibitions, despite the fact there's no specific provision for children at these sites, we know that they would have been here, would have been there. This is another engraving from the early 19th century from Richard Dubourg's detailed exhibition of detailed cork models of Roman and English ruins. And, you know, I'm just fascinated by this quote there, which is that it was frequented by the young ladies and gentlemen during the recesses from boarding school. You know, children were expected to be at these sites. And similarly, if we look at a book published in 1841, London Interiors, most of the heritage sites there show children as a kind of routine presence. I'm particularly fascinated by that one of Elizabeth I's tomb in Westminster Abbey, in fact. I mean, you see there perhaps, you know, a little girl with perhaps 2 adult females, perhaps they're a mother and a governess, I don't know. They're expressing their fascination and awe with what they see, but I think that print argues for the powerful influence a monument I have on modern girlhood in the middle of the 19th century, not because of its aesthetic qualities, but because it's a reasons to explain the history of the nation and particular kinds of female virtue embodied by Elizabeth I. But perhaps the most central figure for me there is the verger, you know, clad in black with his wand as well, and he's not looking at the people who he's not, you know, talking to the other adults there, he's talking to the child. This is modelling the correct behaviour of the girl, but also of the authorities of Westminster Abbey, who are supposed to be using for the first time their site as a kind of childhood education. So that takes us through to phase 2. Yeah, you look at me because I know I've got 2 more phases to go. I understand that. I'll go as quickly as I can. Phase 2, normalisation. So it's really in the private sector, I think, that you see the advances taking place in the 19th century. Private museums like the London Museum's Bullock's Museum in 1812, you know, see children as a regular feature there, and that's true of most museums. Yes, many. I think we've gone slightly out of sequence here, but many museums are charging a smaller amount of money for adults, a smaller amount of money for children than they are for adults. You have commercial providers like train companies as well, who are, charging differential fares, and we start to see in this period attractions really opening up to children. And that's another visitor's book from York Minster, and we see their children becoming an important part of that experience. So in this middle period, we have a lot more evidence of children arriving, but we also have a lot more contestation at these sites. This is a series of articles, a series of letters, which are satirical letters, which are written to Punch. And what they're objecting to there is that cathedrals like St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey are becoming museumified, and there's a kind of objection to that in Punch, so much so, in fact, that they satirize it and say that they should run a train around Westminster Abbey, taking children around to look at the different monuments on a kind of visitor ride. But, what's being objected to there is the museumification, but this is children's presence there is being particularly debated. And we get that everywhere, in fact. When the Crystal Palace opens at Sydenham, you can see, it's just John Ruskin, for instance, becomes embroiled in this. He says, absolutely children should be there because, this artistic education is important to them, but I don't want them there while I'm sketching because they distract me. So there's a kind of whole debate about what children's presence should be. It's becoming more normal, but it's becoming more objected to because it seems to be kind of disrupting the experience that other visitors are happening. There are letters to, the Times, for instance, talking about how it's impossible now to enjoy Stonehenge because children are carving their names on the stones and sliding down the stones. And that's an image from the Tower of London, which just makes this plain, the kind of, objections that people are making. So that brings us on to phase 3, which is a very different kind of experience. In phase 3, I suppose, we're talking about the early 20th century when heritage provision is very different. We've got the start of the National Trust, of course. We've got, the 1913 Ancient Monuments Act, and we've got all sorts of new provision, including at museums. The V&A there has its first children room in 1915. It's not alone. There are others as well. What I'd say is that in this period, despite, kind of increasing state control of state intervention in heritage policy, actually what we're still getting is quite a lot of objection to children being there. The experience of children is certainly not centre stage. In fact, it's seen as very deviant. The model visitor is certainly not young. They're interested in the history and the aesthetics of these sites. They're told not to climb upon the walls. And even though the National Trust, from its beginning, it kind of has children in its ethos and certainly education. This is Robin Fedden, who's writing as late as 1968, Deputy Director of the Trust, and he says, the Trust's duty is one of control rather than inducement, preservation rather than access. In other words, he has no interest in having child visitors at the sites, and that's as late as 1968. Having said that, we know that children were visiting in increasing numbers. You probably saw this, this campaign at Stonehenge, which was trying to capture family photographs of people who'd been there across the 20th century, and there were thousands of them, absolutely fascinating. I'm very grateful to Dawn Hoskins, who'll speak in a second, for drawing my attention to Denton Welsh, whose autobiographical writing from the interwar period shows that he would happily skip school to go and visit cathedrals and country houses. And the sheer numbers of these places, are extraordinary. The sheer numbers of these, the number of visitors. I was going through the National Archives and looking at the records of the Tower of London, and a letter like this just says casually, oh yeah, we're bringing 5,000 children to the Tower of London today, and it's going to be 5,000 tomorrow as well. This is, an extraordinary number of children. Again, though, I think it's the private sector that lends the way, and this is partly at country houses, which for financial reasons do have to do something to try and pay the bills. And at Longleat in 1949, they introduced the Lions, but also plenty of other children's attractions. And that is copied many other places. The one I draw your attention to is Belton House. Belton House is the owner there attempts to kind of pull off the same Longleat trick, but it doesn't work. He builds the adventure playground, and when the National Trust, when it's given to the Trust in 1984, the Trust inherits this, and they decide to make a feature of it. And not only do they keep the adventure playground and the other facilities, they do a tie-in with Helen Cresswell, a children's writer, to try and a book which is going to be set there. And they produce a whole. It kind of reconfigures their understanding of what's going on with children, I think. And for the first time in the mid-80s, we get the pictogram in the members' handbook saying children are absolutely welcome to do this. We get the increasing number of adventure playgrounds. We even get a family handbook being produced. Now that had been going on with the work of John Hoskin, for instance, in the 80s, but it really reaches its apogee, last point, in 1995, when for the first time the Trust's first theme, rather than being, wallpaper or, Rococo architecture, is children welcome. And they introduced Trusty the Hedgehog, the famous motto, but they're also, I don't know if you can read that, but it talks about how central for the first time children are to what the Trust is trying to do and how welcome they are. So that's a very brief version of the long history. I've given it a kind of teleological slant, saying we get from children not welcome to children welcome. But the counter to that teleology is that children were always there. It's just that the providers have changed their attitudes in the state-run ones following, I think, the commercial ones, and that's how I think we've got to where we are today.
So we'll have an opportunity for questions after our next two speakers, and our next speakers are Dawn Hoskin and Lucy Armstrong Blair. We have Lucy coming in online.
So Lucy is speaking first, and Lucy is on Zoom. So hopefully she's going to appear. Oh, there's me. Lucy, would you like to turn your video on?
So while Lucy's doing that, I'll introduce her. She's currently the curator for the National Trust's Herefordshire portfolio, as well as Hanbury Hall and the Children's Country House at Sudbury Hall. And then we'll be hearing from Dawn Hoskin, who's been a cultural heritage curator with the National Trust for 4 years, supporting properties across the Midlands and the east of England, including the Museum of Childhood at Sudbury Hall. And she's also curatorial lead for the National Trust's LGBTQ+ steering group. So I think all the technology is lined up, so take it away, Lucy.
Super. Right. Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm delighted to be able to join you from my office at home, and I know that Dawn's in the audience as well. So I'll be necessarily brief in order to deliver my part of this of the talk, so that Dawn can get onto hers. Just to introduce ourselves, as you've done, we're the National Trust curators who are collaborating with the Oxford University Research team. This particular work is born out of a project that the National Trust is working on to create really the first children's country house at Sudbury, which is something of a paean to John Hutcherson, obviously, who based himself there in the 70s and 80s. However, we're not going to concentrate on Sudbury. We're looking at a wider topic, obviously, of childhood across the National Trust. I'm hoping eventually that Sudbury will become a hub. So in our initial proposal, we intended to speak about the early stages and ambitions of the current collaborative research being undertaken to improve this situation, and supported by the Centre for the History of Childhood. And the initial core aim is to develop a clear overview and an understanding of the presence of children and childhood histories across the whole of the National Trust and its collections, which, as you can imagine, is a pretty mighty task. To date, we have actually received the results of a week-long research project that was conducted by Jim and Lam into our oral history archives, which highlighted some really excellent results, very, very useful, interesting results, and some good statistics as well. We've also just started another project, a 3-month funded project by two joint researchers who are currently running the social media aspect of today's symposium, I think. So thank you, ladies. And that's really to pull together a kind of overview or a gazetteer of stories and archives and material culture relating to childhood across our properties. So for those of you who don't know, I'll give a very brief overview of the Trust, in that we started in 1895 with a piece of coastline in Wales, and the philanthropic principle that beauty, nature and the history of Britain are accessible to everyone and that they should be protected for future generations. So we started off with a piece of land, but obviously that expanded to buildings, coastland, more coast, hillsides of all sorts, park, farmland, And then eventually the great mansions of the wealthy and the titled that house superlative artworks and craftsmanship that might otherwise have been dispersed or lost. And obviously in protecting these things, we found we were also protecting intangibles like the histories of people who lived and worked in these buildings. So we know that a range of histories, places, objects, depictions, accounts, experiences, all of these things intimately connected to childhood can be found throughout the National Trust's properties and their collections. However, these histories of childhood have often received pretty cursory attention, and they've been approached on a largely a property-specific basis or conveyed perhaps as generalised experiences. I would probably say, in all honesty, that childhood-related objects frequently lack supported research, and they're generally poorly catalogued as well. So we don't have the in-house knowledge, or we haven't been developing it in order to really understand these objects and to portray them in a way that might actually be better for them, better for our visitors. And certainly we've, for example, we've assembled varieties of donations of all sorts to create nurseries that respond to a visitor demand to see such rooms, so they're not necessarily specific to the place. In understanding the National Trust as an organisation, it is obviously nationwide, but it consists of something like 600 plus properties, and they might be countryside, they might be the back-to-backs in Birmingham, for example, they might be Ickworth, a grand mansion palace almost of items. So we function sort of like a collective of independent fiefdoms as well, which can obviously enhance the slightly patchy and diffuse nature of our work. Our organisational memory is fairly patchy, and I suppose anybody who's participated in research with us so far will probably have come across this obstacle, but we hope that once we've completed this initial work of mapping the information, increasing understanding of what we have, we can then hope to better realise the absolutely enormous potential that the National Trust represents, both as a wider research resource and a means of engaging with different audiences and subjects, relating specifically to childhood. Sorry, do excuse me. As we started to look at this topic more, it has prompted questions of the history of considering and including children within the National Trust itself. And they come as visitors, members, participants, and we're looking at, they're being included, excluded, targeted, as Matthew's very handily outlined. There's been a bit of a sea change, and it's quite amusing to see, obviously, that some of our attitudes, perhaps the cliches relating to children being within National Trust houses, are 18th, 19th century in origin. So that was interesting to hear. But actually, the more you look, the more assumptions and presumptions are being challenged. And, I think perhaps one thing to bear in mind is obviously many of us working in the National Trust will be here directly as a result of our own formative childhood experiences at a heritage site. So there's clearly something there that's captivating for at least a proportion of childhood visitors. I suppose it is something of a cliche that we don't want children in our houses, and that they're told to sure to stop touching things, whereas actually I think our research would show it's actually more the adults touching things. I think perhaps maybe it belies in insecurity that we're not quite sure in general that children are interested in what we have to offer, which leads to us creating very simple spot the thing trails around houses for younger children, or perhaps just link ups with companies like Cadbury's, perhaps do Easter trails. Matthew also mentioned the ginormous hedgehog called Trusty, who sadly has been missing in action for some time now. So I don't know whether it's RIP for Trusty or not. Maybe he'll make a comeback. But obviously, children have access in a variety of approaches, as part of a family group or a care group, educationally via school, or perhaps socially as part of other organisations who visit our properties. And the language we use to determine between leisure and learning, education and enjoyment, or all that theological, it's complicated and we can trip up. So that's something that we're going to have to determine ourselves. However, we've recognised that obviously the outdoors is our biggest asset, and it's an extremely great draw for visitors, for families. Hence the very successful campaign we ran of 50 things to do before 11 3/4. We hear from our colleagues that moves are afoot to create a more comprehensive offer for children across the National Trust from the centre, which would be really good, good news for the organisation. Although obviously we hope that they'll consider the huge past efforts dispersed that they are that have been made to engage children across our history. And this is Dawn will now offer a précis of those. So I'll hand over to Dawn.
So just to pick up from Lucy there, our early attempts at looking more into previous National Trust efforts to engage children and young people, it's really highlighted the potential valuable or the value of understanding previous challenges, debates, experiments and achievements that have gone before. And today I'm going to quickly highlight three intertwined elements that are ripe for further study and also nicely fit with the timings of the previous paper. So I'm going to be looking at the work of John Hutcherson in the 1960s and 80s, the National Trust Youth Panel in the 70s and 80s, and also the establishment of the Young National Trust Theatre. So have I got slides? Yeah. Okay, all right, I'll carry. In her 2004 Purcell lecture, Britain's Biggest Classroom, Fiona Reynolds, who is then Director General, set out a learning vision for the National Trust that said, rather than being a defined strand of work independent of our other commitments, now firmly places learning at the heart of everything we do. And the title of Reynolds' talk suggested reference, at least to me, to Octavia Hill, one of the National Trust founders, to Octavia Hill's hope to provide open-air sitting rooms for the poor. And the founders of the National Trust, their strong social purpose was very clear. They wanted everyone to be beneficiaries of their passion and for people's lives to be enhanced by the chance to enjoy the properties their trust would acquire. And we had Robert Hunter spoke in the early days of managing buildings as places of resort for recreation and instruction. And commenting on the acquisition of an area of the Lake District to an Oxford audience, Octavia Hill said, "It will be preserved in its present loveliness, and it belongs to you all and to every landless man, woman and child in England." Reynolds' lecture also acknowledged John Hodgson's notable impact, arguably as a pioneer in using historic properties with children for formal and informal learning. So John Hodgson was the first curator for Sudbury Hall in Derbyshire, which came to the National Trust in 1967. Built between, we might get to a nice picture of it in a bit, but built between 1660 and 1680 by George Vernon. It's notable for features including an absolutely amazing carved staircase and in some incredible plasterwork ceilings. Today, it's also known for being home to the National Trust's Museum of Childhood, which is housed in the 19th century service wing, and as of 2021, developing a proposition of being the children's country house at Sudbury Hall. In a moment, we will have a photo of one of Sudbury's recently recruited child ambassadors in the process of learning about caring for some of the museum's collections. But back to Hodgson, who, as Deputy Director of the Jeffrey Museum, now Museum of the Home in London, Hodgson had been involved in arts education, taking city children into the countryside. And in June 1966, he approached the Director for Education in Derbyshire with a suggested scheme for what he dubbed a Discovery Centre property, with the idea that it would be developed with a local education authority in collaboration with the National Trust or a similar organisation. And explaining how it would work, Hodgson declared, quote, "It is obvious that a country house, its estate and the surrounding countryside, especially if they bear visible evidence of change over the centuries, provide an endless range of material for projects involving history, environmental study, geography, natural history and conservation. They also provide a ready-made atmosphere of civilization and culture, as well as an ideal setting for creative activities and physical recreation." Hodgson laid out some challenges and questions that I would argue remain quite familiar, and these included, how can young people be helped to live and work together cooperatively? How can children be prepared to take the fullest advantage of the prospect of vastly increased leisure time? Is it possible to forestall the development of boredom with education felt by many teenagers? How can we provide opportunities for gifted children to meet and do creative work together so they feel less isolated? How can we encourage the appreciation of our national heritage, our countryside, buildings, history, etc.? And how can our excess of lesser country houses be used in a way that will preserve them as living cultural centres without depriving them of their natural furnishing and losing their identity as homes? Hodgson's answer to these questions was very boldly the Discovery Centre, which was described as a fully furnished country house and its surrounding parkland with accommodation for classes of children aged 10 to 12 to stay for a fortnight or 3 weeks, during which they take part in a project related to their schoolwork and the facilities offered by the centre. He concluded that the children should go home exhilarated and inspired to continue the process of discovery. Such is the nature of human development that at this age, even a fortnight of enjoyable and stimulating experience can have a permanent effect in their lives. And in our records, we have the response from Miss Winstanley from the Derbyshire Education Committee, who described it as fundamentally an excellent idea. And she notes, although she advises working it up in a bit more detail, she notes that the National Trust might welcome this kind of use for one of their minor properties. So Hutcherson later described being given a civilised brush-off by the National Trust in about 1968. However, we can see that his name was actually kept on file and noted as someone who would be good to approach or encourage to apply for the upcoming role of curator at Sudbury Hall, which indicates that his ideas and propositions were not necessarily at odds with some of the current National Trust thinking. At this time, the National Trust and Derbyshire County Council were discussing development of a county folk museum at Sudbury. And I've got no time to delve into this today, but it is worth noting the influence and often physical presence of local authority and county museum services with many National Trust properties. So the County Folk Museum did not come to be realised, but from an early phase of installing exhibits connected to childhood, it eventually became the Museum of Childhood. And Hutcherson explained his approach at Sudbury, saying, "I saw my opportunity. I brought in school parties and then started to insinuate education into the house itself, without at first telling the trust. You had to do things that way to show them it would work." He also adds, "I always insisted on restricting numbers, providing a real education programme and an organised enjoyment. That was what made children want to come back again." Although he was one of only a very, very small number of staff supporting Sudbury, through collaboration and support from friends and contacts, he established quite a participative offer in the hall and museum that was for what he described as young and old visitors. And this included what he describes as appropriate activities and games and accurate period dressing up costumes for children in every room in the garden, concerts by leading international performers in the Long Gallery, a fully furnished Victorian drawing room with a range of table games for children to play. And he claims, but I'm open for this to be challenged, the first Victorian schoolroom in any museum with a very strict volunteer school mistress in charge, along with a reconstructed chimney for children to climb. There's various other things, but I'll keep running forwards. So a survey in the late 70s showed in 1 year there was around 75,000 children visiting trust properties. And Hodgson's reputation in the field led him to be appointed what was the Director of Heritage Education year, 1977. And in, I think, the following year or two, the National Trust made him its full-time advisor on heritage education. And this was him, he was then based in Laycock in Wiltshire, although it'd be interesting to look at, he reportedly had a budget of £10,000 to cover England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So it'd be interesting to see how much was achieved or what that indicates. And he remained in post until retirement in 1990. Pressing forward, one archive, are there slides yet? I can whip through them at the end to give an idea. So one archive resource that we've come across recently is the partially scanned minutes of the National Trust's panel for youth, 1973 to 1989. And it's interesting to note youth rather than children. Ooh. Oh. So that's a bit of Sudbury Hall there, and I can. It's possibly pausing on the least interesting. Oh, okay. If we pause on the one that looked like the most boring slide, actually, is where I'm up to. So the one before this. Yeah. So again, we see lots of similarities to conversations today, acknowledging different motivations for visiting and that education and learning can take different forms. They discuss what the National Trust can offer young people in terms of experience, open spaces, residential stays, practical physical skills, and also relationships with groups like the Scouts, the Guides, and the Duke of Edinburgh Awards Scheme. And the common thread that I've picked up is recognition of the importance of that experiential, that kind of the physicality of aspects for impact. In their first meeting, which was 1st February 1973, they talk about, there was already an established Acorn Camp programme, which was a camping kind of residential thing but this is for 16 and 17-year-olds, but they're already noting that they're going to double the previous year's numbers. And agenda item 5 here is looking at encouraging encouraging the interest of young people in the trust, and so they're looking at establishing more active links with local education authorities and similar. They also go on to discuss the nature of school visits, the variety of odd inquiries received from school children, and also looking at the numbers of members aged under 21. Hutcherson came to be a frequent attendee of this. He presented a number of papers and proposals, including in 1980 recommending the National Trust Explorer, a magazine for children. And he also presents drafts on policies for education and proposes a National Trust newsletter for schools. Next slide, please. Hutcherson's proactive and rather independent approach also influenced the founding of the Young National Trust Theatre, when in 1978, Dot McCree, a theatre director, knocked on his door at Sudbury, saying that she'd like to look at doing some theatre and education work. And Hutcherson recalls that they plotted, and they go on to organise a production at Laycock Abbey in Wiltshire, which they felt favourably influenced key National Trust staff. The Young National Trust Theatre became a really sizable in-house theatre and education company run by the National Trust that undertook full-scale participatory projects for schools, which were presented in a variety of properties around the country, and it was still running up until 2000. Their work can be seen in the 1986 Thames television programme A Day in Service, which the BFI hold a copy of. And here the image on the right, at least, is children, actors from the group joined by children from Alfriston Primary School outside Alfriston Clergy House. And I think this is just at the start of their 1995 UK tour. I don't know if there were T-shirts available. And I've recently, next slide please, to end on, I've just recently become aware of the archive of Tony Jackson at De Montfort University. So yeah, I've not been able to visit yet, but it tantalising includes this scrapbook, including photographs, drawings and letters from children that attended and took part in the Young National Trust Theatre. So I'm going to end with the words of David Fish, age 9, who attended at Quarrybank Mill. He says, "I thoroughly enjoyed the play on Wednesday, 23rd May 1979, and I hope you keep doing plays as good as the one you showed me. I think it taught us a lot more than the story we read in a book, because it is much more enjoyable than a book. I like plays when you can join in the parts. I would not like to live in the 1830s or work in a mill like the one the play was in." Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our final speaker for this session is Monica Eileen Patterson, who is Assistant Director of Curatorial Studies in the Institute for Comparative Study of Literature, Art and Culture at Carleton University in Ottawa, in Canada. And she is going to be speaking about listening to children in the Canadian History Hall at the Canadian Museum of History. So over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, I can go ahead and start. Okay, so it's really a pleasure for me to be here today, and I'm excited to discuss some of my ongoing research with my PhD student, Rebecca Friend, that investigates how children's voices and lives have been represented in public history sites like museums, with a particular interest in how we might better engage with the knowledge, perspectives, and experiences of children from the past and in the present and future. So this work is part of my interest in helping to forge a new critical children's museology, which is grounded in the production of museum content and programming, not just for or about children, but also by and with children in ways that engage them as valued social actors and knowledge bearers. And I'll just lead with my main argument here as it fits into the larger panel, which is to say that the way that we make heritage sites more welcoming, interesting, and engaging to children is to better represent children. And I'll say a bit more about that now. So how are children represented in public memory? Within most history museums, children are superficially represented in well-worn, overly simplistic tropes, overwritten by adult nostalgia, romanticism, and sentimentalism. Rarely are the details of their lives, not to mention their ideas or perspectives, engaged in a substantive and nuanced way. This representation is especially true for racialized children and those from other historically marginalized groups. Children are often presented as examples of a generic type, so we see lots of references to 10-year-old boy, and overwhelmingly as historical victims. But curating traces of children's material and immaterial culture can offer insight into young people's understandings of cultural, political, and social matters, unique and valuable perspectives that deserve closer attention. So to do so, I will turn to a key site of national memory production, the Canadian Museum of History and their newly revamped Canadian History Hall. So this opened 4 years ago now on the politically fraught 150th anniversary of Confederation. And the image that is sort of appearing and disappearing before your eyes is of the Museum of History there. And I can move forward to, so we can keep going. Yeah, that's good. I have only a couple images here. So there are 3 galleries in this exhibit. Early, colonial, and modern Canada are featured. And as many scholars have noted, much of what has been collected by museums relating to children's lives is preserved for its ability to conjure a sense of romanticized nostalgia among adults. So this sentimental approach remains a popular strategy in both collection efforts and in object displays. Scholar Sharon Brookshaw differentiates between the material culture of childhood and the material culture of children, arguing that much of children's material worlds are produced and imposed upon them by adults. So this includes toys, games, books, clothing, educational materials, as well as furniture and household objects intended for children. So when displayed in museums, these examples of what Brookshaw labels the material culture of childhood often reflect the predilections and sensibilities of adults. By contrast, the material culture of children are objects that are created, modified, and manipulated by children themselves based on their own interests and needs. So these objects do not form their own discrete or pure category, but rather range from constructions made out of materials that have been repurposed for use as toys. They can include natural materials that have been transformed into extensions of a child's imagination, or existing objects that have been modified or utilized in innovative ways. So these categories of the material culture of childhood and the material culture of children are always overlapping, I think, and the boundaries between them are sometimes difficult to discern. But historians and museum practitioners alike can nevertheless recognize the ways in which the former have so often stood in for the latter, effectively occluding and obscuring children's perspectives and experiences. So in returning to our case study, the first impression that we had was just a sense of almost overwhelm at how ubiquitous children actually were in these galleries. And that was quite a nice discovery. So they appear most commonly in photographs, but also there are children's toys, archaeological fragments, and then increasingly as you sort of progress through time, as you get closer to the modern gallery, you see more representations of children that are named and quoted and really give us a sense of their individual personhood. So I'll start with a discussion briefly of this display of the Boy Scout and Girl Guide uniforms. And this is an interesting one because on the one hand you see this gender binary being presented, which is very much reflective of the times in the 60s. So this is in a display on the baby boom. And you have the boys' side with the Wild West motif accompanied with the child-sized Royal Canadian Mounted Police costume, a hockey game. And then on the girls' side, we see a doll and a mini cooking oven. So what's interesting to me about this particular point in the museum is that at first glance, the exhibition of mass-produced toys seems like an example of material culture of childhood. But a curatorial decision was made to display toys that had been used. So you see these traces, if you're able to look closely, that mark the presence of actual children. And I think that this gives us an opportunity to tease out the less evident contributions that children can make to objects' histories. In the text, we are pointed to the nostalgic frame of remembering popular toys, games, and children's organizations from the period with a question that says, are any of these familiar to you? So that clearly seems to be speaking to an older adult audience, which I argue is kind of a missed opportunity for a more child-centered engagement. But I do commend the curators for including these objects not in their most pristine forms, and also the guide uniforms were worn by actual named children. And historical photographs of these individuals are included in the text panel, which I think helps to give a sense of the kind of aura of authenticity that museums are often really looking for. So in the next image, what you would see is a Canadian flag display. And this is a kiosk that is interactive and features a dozen or so examples of children's submissions to the open call for proposals for a new Canadian flag. And this happened in 1964, where proposals were sent to a multi-partisan committee to adopt a new flag. A caption written by the child artist accompanies each of the digitized drawings in the display, elevating children's voices and providing museum visitors with a glimpse into the world of Canadian childhood during the politically tense 60s. So we see from these submissions children engaging with Canadian politics, but they also express, a range of different ideas and messages. At times they're symbolic, historical, intertextual, and ludic. And this, of course, shows the varied ways that Canadian children engage with pressing political discourse and are aware of social tensions. So one submission features a fleur-de-lis, maple leaf, and beaver. And this contribution by Matthew Studi was explained by saying that he hoped his flag would even make the French happy. This is perhaps an attempt to ameliorate, poke fun at, or even maybe stoke the historical discord between French and English Canada. Another submission includes a red map of all of Canada's territory emblazoned with the phrase "Land of Liberty." And the contributor to that, Jane Teeter, says there will be no argument in any of the provinces about not being respected because her submission includes all. Now, crucially missing from Teeter's narrative and proposal is, of course, any acknowledgement of Canada's colonial history of genocide and the vast unceded territories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit that the nation currently occupies. So these voices, I think, are also very important material for us as historians and as citizens to engage with critically. Okay, I'm going to move very quickly here to finish up. So there's, if you could just move forward one slide, the other way. Yes. So here we have a quote from activist Harriet Cunningham, who says, "I don't want to be just someone wearing a costume. I want to be me." And Harriet is an activist fighting for trans and LGBTQ rights. In this section of the museum, we see children as activists, as political actors, and as people who are participating in their societies in a variety of ways. And upon my many visits to the museum, I've noticed that there are these sort of hot spots in the galleries that tend to attract and sort of retain young people, some more than others. And what I've observed is that displays that feature children's words, their photographs of them, their material culture, they tend to draw children, but also the adults that accompany children to museums. So the last image I'll show it comes from one of the most challenging displays in the section on modern Canada. And this relates to the Indian residential school system in Canada, which I don't have a lot of time to go into detail about, but it features an image of now adult survivors of these enforced boarding school systems with artwork that they created, and you can go forward to get to that image. Artwork that they created that was saved by an art teacher, and they were later reunited with. So this is, for me, a very complex example of the ways in which children's cultural production can be curated and presented to the public in complex ways that help us to think about and challenge some of the overly simplistic tendencies that we have in thinking about childhood's past, which often tend to overwrite these childhoods with assumptions about dominant groups. So, white settler histories have really dominated a lot of the storying of the Canadian past, and not just the Canadian past, but all around the world. And these images, these artworks were actually reunited with the survivors through a sustained and careful process of dialogue and collaboration, oral history interviews. So the image that is presented here is just sort of the tip of the iceberg of several years worth of engagement and efforts to build community, to build trust, and to start doing some of the much needed, much belated hard work of reconciliation. So I think I'm probably out of time, and I will just close there by saying also that I think for me this is where new children's museology comes in. And while the Canadian Museum of History draws from a substantial collection supported by national funding in order to solicit and maintain the large quantity of children's material culture that it features in its new history hall, not all museums have immediate access to such resources. They must therefore make an active commitment to researching, collecting, preserving, and exhibiting children's material and immaterial culture, and recognizing its importance for public historical knowledge more broadly. In doing so, future generations of museum practitioners and visitors will better recognize the small but significant footprint that children have left behind. Thank you.